Hello and welcome to Leaders Live. I'm Cameron McDonald, this is James Emmett, and it's great to be with you, whether you're watching live, catching up, or listening via podcast.
Yes, we're back here in the IMG studios in the heart of Stockley Park, bringing you this month's fresh take on the most important sports industry topics with a gaggle of experts helping us along the way.
Sure are. You might be watching us live on Twitter or LinkedIn, but you can listen to us on the Leaders Sport Business podcast feed. Watch on demand at any point and get in touch with us whenever you like. You can tweet us at LeadersBiz. You can comment either underneath or to the side of the feed on LinkedIn, or you can revert to email like the old days. It's studio@leadersinsport.com.
Do you have access to that email, Cam?
I do have some access, not all access.
I don't have access to that. Coming up, we will be taking a deep dive on the world of fight sports and how it all really works behind the scenes. We'll be joined by Queensberry Promotions Chief Executive George Warren, as well as BT Sports Head of Boxing and Pay-Per-View Louisa Clark, to give us the inside scoop.
And Michael Ridout, Vice President of IMG Media, will also be with us, joining the conversation.
But first, a look into the inner workings of the most famous rugby brand in the world, the All Blacks. Since a game-changing investment from Silver Lake earlier this year, New Zealand Rugby also has one of the most innovative commercial setups in the sport.
That they do. This partnership has seen the setup of New Zealand Rugby Commercial, which houses all of New Zealand Rugby's revenue-generating assets and invests in rugby-related opportunities globally.
The All Blacks are over in the UK for the Autumn International. So to talk us through all of that and more is Richard Thomas, CEO of New Zealand Rugby Commercial. Richard, thanks for being with us. How are you doing?
Very good, and thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Richard, the team is over opening up a can of whoop-ass all over the country for the next 3 weeks. You're over with them. What is on your agenda from a business perspective?
Yeah, look, we're here to see people, to say hello to our partners, to get face-to-face. You know, we're a long way away, in truth, from a lot of our relationships, so it's great to come and see some people. And it's great to have conversations that are about the All Blacks, but also about our women's teams, because of the Rugby World Cup going on in New Zealand at the moment. And it's been really good having that dual conversation about, you know, brilliant men's team in the All Blacks and brilliant women's team in the Black Ferns.
Yeah.
So it's exciting.
So I guess you've got meetings all day and you're watching TV all night.
24 hours of rugby.
Yeah, yeah.
A full schedule. Of course, you mentioned there the World Cup, and the Black Ferns will be playing in the final this weekend. A huge moment, obviously, for New Zealand Rugby. What are some of the other milestone moments for New Zealand Rugby over the last 12 months?
Yeah, and you're right, the Rugby World Cup is a milestone moment. World record crowds, world record experiences, so that's incredibly exciting for women's rugby, and we're really proud of that. But then, of course, for us, the new partnership with Silver Lake and the establishment of New Zealand Rugby Commercial this year, starting in July. That's a big moment for our sport. It's a big moment for us commercially and as an organisation. So, yeah, those two are probably the biggest things for the year.
Richard, we're going to dive into both of those things, or all of those things, in a bit more detail a little later. But first, I'd like to play a game with you, if that's OK. It's a game that I'm calling Getting to Know Richie T from New EZ, right? And it's a quick fire round. So 6 questions. Not going to limit you to one word, but maybe one sentence answers.
Okay.
Are you ready? Mm-hmm. First sporting memory.
First football memory, probably Manchester United against Coventry, in Coventry. Gary Bailey, South African in goal.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing memory.
Worth saying that you're a Brit, aren't you?
Originally Brit, yeah. Now also a Kiwi.
Yeah. Best sports programming or documentary?
For me, it's got to be Sunderland Till I Die. I just love the fan side of that story.
You're not a Sunderland fan, are you?
I'm definitely not.
No, well, not after that, I guess. Best commercial deal in sport in the last 2 years?
So I'm going to be biased here. The deal we did with Ineos to establish a performance partnership, and their performance network is really interesting and exciting for us.
Mm-hmm. And you've got Dave Brailsford coming with you to one of the games?
Yeah, Dave's coming to the England game in a couple of weeks.
Fantastic. Favourite place to travel to on business?
Tricky one. There's a tiny little town called Asolo, north of Treviso in Italy, where our partner Replay is based, and it's a special place.
Good to have a reason to go there, huh? Yeah. A very good piece of commercial business, that. Acumen. Most meaningful sports industry relationship outside of your sport?
Yeah, I'm going to have to take 2 here.
OK.
There's a guy called Sam Walsh who works in the intersection of tech and content and streaming in the Australia, used to be with the AFL. Mm-hmm. And then our new relationship that we're building with Manchester City Football Group, where we're learning from each other, which is really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And finally, one word to sum up the state of the business of rugby right now.
Opportunity.
Okay. All right. It's suitably optimistic, that. That's very good. That's Richie T from New EZ. That's the quickfire round over. Well done, Richard.
Well, very interesting. That's the man. We're, of course, here to hear also about the organisation, the setup of New Zealand Rugby Commercial. How has the wider New Zealand Rugby Commercial organisation changed over the last few years? What's new? What's different? What's changed since the setup of New Zealand Rugby Commercial?
Look, I think the biggest thing for us has been a clearer focus on the things that make a big difference. And for us, that's really trying to focus on fans. Ultimately, the fans are the key driving force behind everything we do. And I think that many sports, and certainly us too, probably focused on the people in the middle. What were our commercial partners wanting? What were our broadcasters wanting? Ultimately, what they want is fans, and what we want is fans. So that's been the big difference, I think, is a real focus on our fan base.
So New Zealand Rugby Commercial obviously set up on the back of Silver Lake coming in, investing significant amount of money for quite a small, a modest stake in this new entity. So the public, correct me if I'm wrong here, Richard, as well, but the public figures, or figures that Google has told me, they've invested 200 million New Zealand dollars for something like a 6% stake?
Just under 6%.
Just under 6% stake. Talk us through getting that deal done, I guess, and the kind of the risks and the rewards as you saw them putting it together. Maybe some of the pushback that you were receiving as it was coming together.
Yeah, look, it was obviously a long time in the building, as it turned out. It took us about a couple of years to make that deal come alive. I think we focused a lot on alignment and alignment of values. We're not just a sports brand, we're a national identity almost as well. Mm-hmm. And so partnering with someone that understood and shared our values was a critical piece of the conversation. And a lot of credit to Silver Lake. They really spent time understanding us and understanding not just New Zealand Rugby, but also the players, the people of New Zealand, what it means to us. Mm-hmm. So we did that, but we were really focused on how we could drive some growth. Yep. And how they could help us, particularly with their tech and digital expertise, and what they could bring to our desire to focus on our fan and commercial outcomes. Mm-hmm. And probably the pushback was really only about, are we really aligned? Right. And we had some long and good conversations with our player group, particularly, and that was primarily around alignment, and also a little bit about, was the deal exactly right? Could we find other ways to kind of make it work where it wasn't sort of die in the ditch for either side, but it would make it different and better. So yeah, it was an interesting time, really rewarding in the end. We're pretty excited by it, but a lot of late nights.
So you're in the unusual position, right, of being a leader in world sport with, hundreds of millions of dollars in your back pocket ready to spend rather than the other way around, right?
Well, it's not quite all gone to my back pocket, I'm afraid, James. I wish it had. No, look, we've got a bit of money to invest, which is exciting, but a large part of the money that we brought in has actually gone back into the community and the grassroots game in New Zealand. So we were looking to invest, create investment opportunity, but we were also looking to really, support the game and put some money back into 130 years of development, really.
Yeah.
Lots of exciting stuff to unpack there, but let's take a step outside of New Zealand for a second. There's been a lot of talk about restructuring club rugby and rugby in general here in the Northern Hemisphere. What's your view on all of that?
I think it'd be dangerous for me to give you a strong opinion on Northern Hemisphere rugby, sure. But I would say that when we redesigned Super Rugby Pacific, we did it primarily from a fan perspective. What did our fans want? And in that case, for instance, they wanted Pacific Island teams, and we brought in 2 Pacific Island teams, one from Fiji, one based in New Zealand, from the other in Samoa and Tonga Islands. So, we were really focused on what would make a difference for fans, and I think that's probably what the key is up here and globally. Are we bringing fans what they want at a club level? We're looking at, the World season. Can we bring clubs into that conversation whereby our clubs are playing the Northern Hemisphere? What's the world international game look like? How do we make fans have something to engage in, something interesting that ultimately is about growing the game? We believe that it's about growing the game as opposed to having a knife fight in a telephone box over something that's not getting any bigger.
And it's all fans first, is the way you've approached it.
Fans first is the way we think about it. Ultimately, the commercial outcomes are critical, but we think that the commercial outcomes will follow engaging, a positive, interesting storylines, things that fans can get interested in and motivated by. And we'd love to see the structures of all of rugby reflect that, internationally, club, etc. So certainly not my place to describe what the solution is for the Northern Hemisphere, but we think working together we can find ways to do that.
You mentioned up top that a lot of what you're doing over here is catching up with partners, meeting old friends. You're talking to a lot of people, right? When you're up here, there's a lot of rugby stakeholders here in the UK and in the wider area. We are sort of entering a new era in rugby, I think. We're on the cusp of potentially quite significant change. We're in the private finance era for rugby. Obviously, Silver Lake down there with you guys in New Zealand. In the Northern Hemisphere, we've seen CVC invest significant money in lots of different entities in rugby. I think they're in Six Nations, Premiership Rugby, also what was the Pro 14, now United Rugby. A lot of people talking about, this money's gone in, but we haven't actually seen what the end game is for that. How much consultation are you having with the people in charge of those entities? I mean, Simon Massey-Taylor up here, Ben Morrell, I know you're meeting these guys. Are they asking advice for how to deal with sort of private finance? And what are those conversations like? Yeah, look, we've spoken a lot with the guys. I mean, we spent some time talking to CVC as well. After all, they're effectively partners in the global game now as well. Yeah. We spend time talking to Simon and Ben, of course, and others. I certainly wouldn't say they're asking for advice. I mean, they probably started this journey with private finance a little before us, actually. But we are strongly of the belief that this is ultimately going to be successful through cooperation, not fighting with each other. We believe, and we think that that's also the world that private equity wants to inhabit here in the Northern Hemisphere. Grow the game. We're still pretty small relative to some of the major global sports. We're a global sport with global appeal. And so how do we make sure we really grow our fan base, and how do we get these private finance partners to support that? And my understanding certainly is that they're keen to do that. They're keen to create the right storylines for fans. And I think what I've seen so far with both, to be fair, CVC and Silver Lake is a kind of long-term view. So when we worked with Silver Lake, and what was interesting about that was, you might call them a private equity group. We call them a tech investor with a long horizon. And that's a very different conversation than come in, burn it all up and get out after 3 years. And I don't think any of the private finance people coming in seem to have that sort of short-term agenda, which is really good.
Speaking of long-term agendas, you sort of mentioned earlier that the World Cup going on at the moment, huge milestone, of course, for New Zealand rugby over this last year, over the last few years, I'm sure. Beyond that tournament, where is women's rugby sitting in your wider commercial strategy, your wider commercial plan?
Yeah, look, it's an incredibly exciting time. We are having conversations now at a commercial level, which have gender mixed, gender diverse conversations, which is really cool. I was just in Japan as an example, talking about how we get their women's rugby and our women's rugby cooperating commercially and on the pitch. We see it as critical to growth. So, I've now spoken about fans almost constantly, I suppose, today. But, if we think about the wider fan base, men and women, girls and boys, women's rugby plays a key part in that. Sure. So for us, that core opportunity around fan engagement and women's rugby is key. We think that we also need to give those, those athletes, some of our stars, Ruby Tui, Portia Woodman, Kendra Cox-Edge, who are kind of really helping promote the game. The opportunity to have value and be recognised and celebrated in their own right, as opposed to sort of as a subset of men's rugby, which I think perhaps, rugby's been a bit guilty of in the past. And so, having commercial relationships that are specifically around women's rugby, we think is really important. And we've seen that happen in football, particularly up here in Europe, which has been really strong. And, where, you think about the kind of creator economies, and the athletes as creators, and I know you've talked about that previously. We think some of those, female rugby stars are spectacularly good at that and really engaging. So ultimately, we think the commercial growth of everything is about what all of our teams and players can bring.
Must be nice to be having conversations about the Black Ferns brand as well as the All Blacks brand, of course.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. And if we're honest about it, it's been coming for a while, but this World Cup is we think a big trigger moment for the growth of that.
I want to sort of zoom in on that brand question a bit. And anyone who runs commercial operations at New Zealand Rugby has the challenge that you have, right? Which is, on the one hand, custodianship of the brand and the sort of imperative to maintain the mystique, the myth of the All Blacks brand, and on the other hand, to commercialize the heck out of it, right? to make revenue, to drive revenue from it. Two questions. First question: I presume when you join the organisation, they teach you how to do the haka, right?
You definitely learn.
Right, you learn. The second question: what is your approach? What's your approach to striking that balance?
Yeah, and I don't know if there's a perfect answer on any of these things, but ultimately, we're a values-based business, and our brands are values brands, really. And particularly when you talk about something like the All Blacks, which is more than a rugby brand, it's a form of national identity. And so ultimately the responsibility we hold commercially, as you talk about guardianship, isn't just to our brands, to our players, to our teams, it's actually to our country. Everyone effectively owns the All Blacks. We don't own it. It's owned by the people of New Zealand, really, as a brand. So the questions we ask ourselves, which helps us manage that, is, could we stand up in front of our friends, family, grandparents, hand on heart, and say, yeah, you can still be proud of us and this brand? Mm-hmm. Does that ring true for New Zealand? Mm. Are we, to some extent, a force for good? Mm. Right? And so those are the questions we have to ask ourselves. Mm-hmm. And then we balance that with, well, yeah, we need to grow quickly, and we need to generate the financial outcomes. We don't think we don't think those need to be in conflict. Mm. In fact, we think one of the reasons that commercially our business has been successful and will be successful is because of what our brand values stand for and the meaning. And if we ever betray that, actually, we think we'll hurt our commercial outcomes as well. Mm-hmm.
Quick follow-up, if I may. I know one of the core values of New Zealand Rugby is this. It's been written about a lot. It's the no dickheads rule, right? We're going to have to put an expletive on this podcast episode. But the no dickheads rule, does that also apply to brand partners?
We certainly try and do that. I can't say that we necessarily are able to.
You can't guarantee it.
Rule out every single person inside a brand relationship. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, look, we certainly have. We've got great partners, and they seem to get who we are, and that seems to apply to them too.
You've spoken sort of a lot about the important things to consider long-term, sort of fans, values, all this. What's the golden goose when you're sort of looking forward to 2023 beyond? What's the sort of big revenue generating opportunity that you're either hoping to expand upon or maybe sort of pounce upon for the first time? Is it an increased focus on Gen Z? Is it this sort of mysterious realizing the potential of Web3, or is it something else completely different?
Yeah, I would love to know what the answer to the golden goose is, but we look at a number of those things. We've recently started our journey into Web3. We did some NFTs to celebrate the Black Ferns World Cup, which is a first for us, and to learn about that really, as opposed to kind of profit from it. Ultimately, we are pretty interested in direct fan relationships. So we believe really that the unlock for the long-term success in commercial is more fans directly connected to us in some way, having a conversation, understanding what they're motivated and interested in. So the golden goose ultimately is probably direct fan relationships connected with us, and we believe a growing fan base, so that we're connecting with more people. We're understanding what they're motivated by. We're serving them things that they want and that we want. And therefore that unlocks all of our revenue opportunities, I think.
And are there is it more people generally you're trying to reach? Are there any specific demographics that you're looking forward to try and activate?
Yeah, look, and it sort of depends a little bit market by market. We're lucky enough to have a brand that resonates in almost everywhere in the world. So if you think about most of the world, we'd like younger audiences to come to rugby a bit more than perhaps they have. Sure. We're not quite as, you used the word Gen Z, but I don't think we think about it quite that way. We think about it, as audiences, who we think will be the future of rugby at a playing and also, commercial level. And we also think that there's audiences who we're lucky enough to contact and be able to talk to who are not necessarily rugby fans. There's a very significant proportion of our fan base who would tick a box that says they're not a rugby fan, but they are an All Blacks fan. And so for us, that's about social and cultural identity, values, And if we can, do something with that group of people, doesn't matter about their demographics, what's their attitude to life, then that's really where we're at. We think our brands have resonance there.
Richard, I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. I wish you well personally, don't get me wrong, but I'm hoping for a Black Ferns defeat to England on the weekend. But Richard Thomas, thank you very much indeed. We turn our attention now to fight sports in a moment here on Leaders Live. But first, a taster of where we will be in March.
The real thing that we want to bring together is to tell every girl, every lady within the community of Abu Dhabi that we are here for them.
The way that we have impact is by establishing platforms that drive ecosystems.
And we've had our launch this week. That's right, for the 5th year running, we're back in Abu Dhabi for the Leaders Sport Business Summit. Mark your calendars for the 1st and 2nd March 2023 as we welcome 450 of the best and brightest from across the industry to the Yas Marina circuit for 2 days of top quality conversation, both on and off the stage. For more information, check out leadersinsport.com. James, where are you?
I'm over here, actually, to talk about today's deep dive, which is on the business behind fight sports, boxing and MMA. Boxing is for many the purest form of sport, one-on-one and real, and still based on the original Queensberry rules drawn up for it in the mid-1800s. Its cultural cut-through is significant. Boxing's historic stars are household names. Think Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, Mike Tyson, Floyd Mayweather Jr., Manny Pacquiao, and now Tyson Fury. For some, it's the purest form of sports marketing too. Boxing events are as much about showmanship as the fights themselves are about punching. Boxing events and the people who push them are called promotions. That word is key. It's up to the promoter and the protagonist to generate interest and income in a match. A lot goes into that, but the formula is simple. Sell to a venue, sell to a broadcaster, sell to the public. And there really are major revenue streams there. Anthony Joshua's rematch with Alexander Usyk earlier this year saw Saudi Arabia pay a reported $80 million to host it. The 2015 fight of the century between Mayweather Jr. and Pacquiao holds the pay-per-view record, with 4.6 million buys, which generated $410 million. Making a good match is the starting point there, but then generating wide appeal in it is an art. Take Muhammad Ali again, the greatest fighter that ever lived, but also the greatest showman. He floated like a butterfly, he stung like a bee, but he talked like a promoter too. Then there's Don King, a flamboyant businessman who brought big-time boxing to Vegas. He played the venue game too, getting Zaire's leader Mobutu to put up $10 million to host the Rumble in the Jungle in 1974. But as simple as the premise of boxing and the business behind it is, the sport is also confusing. There are 17 weight classes in professional boxing and 5 recognised belts for each of the divisions. I can't even do the maths on that. For the casual fan, it can be difficult to understand the context of what you're watching. And here's where MMA comes in. The meteoric rise of the UFC from niche outlaw practice to established multi-billion-dollar sporting brand has provided a new formula for fight sports. The promotion fundamentals are the same, but the structures and the power balance between the stakeholders involved are very different. The UFC is tightly controlled from the centre, unlike boxing. On the surface, the way the selling works is similar too. There are the stars with outsized personalities and a neat line in trash talk, think Conor McGregor, and the promoters, well, one promoter at least, with similar attributes. But the UFC is more like a US major league than a boxing promoter. It decides centrally what its fighters will be paid. It sells sponsorship, broadcast and hosting deals centrally, leveraging the brand as much as any individual fighter or match. And in 2016, it was bought by Endeavour in a deal that valued it at $4.3 billion. there will be boxing promoters who looked at that deal with more than a little admiration. And now the lines are blurring. The second biggest pay-per-view boxing event of all time was in 2017 between Mayweather Jr. and Conor McGregor, a UFC fighter against a boxer. The traditionalists scoffed, but 4.3 million people paid for that fight, generating $396 million. And more recently, we've seen the rise of content creators in fight sports, the likes of Jake Paul, monetizing his social following via pay-per-view events. So what next for the business of fight sports? Let's scrap it out after this.
Unbelievable! Is that Mike Tyson down? Liverpool against all odds!
The way he pulled that out of the fire, the biggest upset in the history of the sport.
A truly remarkable night. They said it would never happen! I can't believe it! Long live the Gypsy King!
Looking forward to that one. Now I'm delighted to say we are joined live by Louisa Clark, Head of Boxing and Pay-Per-View at BT Sport, George Warren, Chief Executive Officer of Queensberry Promotions, and Michael Ridout, Vice President of IMG Media. Thanks all for joining us. Welcome to the studio. Let's set the scene. Let's get a bit of context. What are the relationships at play here? How are you all working together? George, you're a man in the middle, both figuratively and in the sense, literally as well. Why don't we start with you on that?
Louisa and I, we work very closely together, but she is my counterpart at BT Sport. BT Sport are our rights partner in the UK and Ireland. Mike at IMG, we work together again, try work together as best as possible at times. We always don't see eye to eye on everything, but Mike works with us on a number of territories around the world as our agent for international rights.
And what's the relationship between yourself and Louisa, Michael?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, actually, Louisa, I've been at IMG 16 years.
Right.
Another lifer, yes.
I know. No, I'm an intern compared to most people. Actually,
Whoa.
16. So, Louisa, I'm often asked, what's your best moment at IMG? And the moment I knew I'd made it, actually was, and here we go, here's a name drop. We were in Tyson Fury's dressing room after he'd just become world champion. And Louisa asked me to take a picture of her and Tyson in his boxer shorts. So that, for me, was when I knew
You'd made it.
A peek behind the curtain for sure, that one.
Exactly. But no, look, Louisa and I, we work very closely together on a number of things, but more recently with UFC. UFC work with BT Sport in the UK and Ireland, and Louisa is involved a lot in our pay-per-view business. So when we run pay-per-view events on BT, Louisa's very involved.
I'm just on the LinkedIn cam, and sorry to those of you that put questions in for Richard. We will get to them we promise we'll get to them if you fire them in for this session. So LinkedIn, the Leaders LinkedIn, Twitter @LeadersBiz, do keep it coming in. On every podcast, they say at some stage, usually about 40 minutes in, let's jump straight in then. So shall we jump straight in then?
Let's do it.
Fight sports, we had a little explainer there kind of contextualising how fight sports and MMA kind of work. Michael, we'll start with you here. IMG works across all sorts of different sports, all sorts of different entertainment products. Where do you think fight sports sits currently in the kind of league table of hot properties? And, what's it competing against in the battle for kind of consumer attention?
Okay, so two questions. Well, look, I'll answer the second question first in that I don't think fight sports is unique in battling for that consumer attention. Every sport wants to be consumed by somebody, and it's not just sport, it's entertainment.
Yeah.
So I don't think fight sports is unique in a sense where it is trying to attract a viewer. The problem that fight sports has, as well as every other sport, is that attention is harder to grab. There's never been a time where there is so much content out there, spread out across so many different platforms. So that consumer attention is really hard. And then when you break it down a little bit further, those individual consumers are so different. So my 13-year-old nephew, who may have 3 hours spare in an evening, he's got an hour on TikTok, an hour on Snapchat, an hour on Call of Duty. How do you get his attention? My 66-year-old father, he may have 3 hours watching TV, but he's got Netflix, he's got Sky, he's got BT, he's got all other things that he can consume. So how does a rights holder get his attention? I think we could probably talk about this for hours, which I won't bore you with, but just two little things. I think number one, you need a strategy to kind of fish where the fishes are. You need to have content put in front of people's eyes where they are consuming content. And I think that content needs to be catered for that platform. I think that's really important. And number two, possibly more pertinent to fight sports, is you got to make people care. You've got to ask yourself, why does somebody want to watch my product? And I think, twofold. One, the fighter needs to make that happen. They can do that job, but also the promoter. And I think, it's testament to what George and what his father has done over the last 40 years. They have done that better than anybody in creating stars, creating characters, giving a reason for people to watch. And to answer your first question, I think in terms of fight sports, it's probably never been more popular. The amount of content that is out there to consume, both on TV and digital, is unbelievable. And obviously from a UFC perspective, we've seen unbelievable growth over the last 5-10 years. So fight sports is in a very good position.
Quite high up there on the league table.
Very, very high.
Sorry, we didn't give Louisa a right to reply. She was accused. I don't know whether you noticed, Cameron. Louisa was accused of ogling Tyson Fury in his boxer shorts.
That is true.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to deny this?
The most embarrassing photo of my life, that photo.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's I think that's the point we're making, right? That Tyson sort of cuts through above the sport itself. So even like a non-boxing fan would know who Tyson is, because actually he's a good promoter of his own brand. And part of the issue is you can have a lot of talent in the sport, but now if you can't go where all the eyeballs are off the platform, elsewhere in social, or cut through in other sports like Tyson doing some stuff in WWE, then actually, as a promoter and as a broadcaster, you want good athletic talent, people who can win world titles, but also people that consumers can connect with. And that's where it's tricky, because if you're an introverted athlete, that's quite hard for you. It's much easier to step forward and be seen if you're somebody who enjoys the razzmatazz and social media and taking clips of your home life and you're funny and all of those things. I think that's where also you struggle across entertainment, like you're competing against the latest version, the new release of The Crown. But also, who are you as a person? Can your personality cut through against other athletes that are still around?
Yeah, be interesting, that Venn diagram of like people are interested in fight sports and people are interested in The Crown. I wonder what's in the middle.
That would be me.
Yeah. I know Cam is itching to ask a question, but I just want to make sure, Louisa, that we have your perspective on what we put to Michael earlier, which is, where do you, representing BT Sport, obviously a broadcaster of all sorts of different sports, where do you see fight sports in that kind of,
I think Mike's right. They're right up there. And I think that's because they've had quite a flurry of engaging athletes within them that understand the business that they're in, they understand the audience that they're trying to appeal to, and are working quite hard at that. I think they are right up there. I think obviously they're still trying to compete in a sports sense with the World Cup, with football generally, with other sports, but they're really holding their own. And the stable of fighters, like if you look at boxing, the competition in boxing across all of the broadcasters with the different promoters has actually allowed a lot of boxers to be in a camp, to be picked up by a promoter, and to have a chance to be on TV, because there's a lot of boxing on TV now, which brings its other issues around
positives and negatives,
scheduling and clashing. But yes, I think the public is quite engaged in live sport, especially sport like ours with jeopardy, which is what really that does it for people. It's actually the jeopardy of what might happen.
What I'm keen to sort of get to the bottom of is sort of talking about this engaging with fans, engaging with the audience. From your perspective, George, obviously building the profile of fighters and sort of telling that story has got to be extremely important. How have you seen that changing with the advent of different forms of long-form and short-form content? Obviously, Michael, you mentioned things like, for example, TikTok or Snapchat. We've got Instagram Reels, all these different forms and sort of ways of consuming it on TV or on your phone. How has that affected what you're doing?
It's advantageous from the perspective of the promoter. It's given us a multitude of different ways of being able to engage with potential customers, to reach those customers. Younger audiences, obviously, if we're trying to get new and young people interested in the sport, going through the likes of TikTok, your Instagrams, it's going to be far more productive than doing your traditional kind of paying for adverts still in the Sun newspaper, but that kind of content's still required, that kind of advertising's still required. The fighters themselves have now taken a lot more responsibility in building their own brand. We're big advocates of them doing it and engaging with their own fan bases and growing that fan base, selling tickets directly with customers by kind of reaching out and talking to them, getting their personality across. As you say, short-term content such as uploading kind of gym access footage. Saw some of that really successful recently with Tommy and Tyson with their lead-in with their fights that are coming up. Tommy's fighting in Dubai this weekend. And obviously we've got the big stadium event with Tyson at the beginning of December. So all of that's really important. I think it's just, I don't think there's anything that's necessarily happened that you can kind of pinpoint and say anything's necessarily changed. You've just got to go with it. Where are people digesting content? Where are they learning news about the sport? Where are they learning their information? How do they find out what their fighters, their favourite fighters or their favourite sports stars are up to? What are the new trends and stuff? And kind of with that data-driven feedback from people far smarter in my office that are far more capable at reading that stuff than I will ever be. We take that, we utilise it, and then that gives us the opportunity to do a far better at our next promotion in engaging with that audience.
So as the promoter then, would you say when it comes to your fighters, there's guidelines that you're applying to fighters, or is it very much sort of a let them run with it and then do the timing?
No. I mean, you know, very early on, I mean, we work with a stable of circa 80 fighters, so it's not always available for us to give each one kind of sole direct kind of this is what you can and can't do at all such times. You see obviously things happen on social media, not just in fight sports but in other sports and other entertainment. People do silly things, but the general consensus is that when we start with fighters, particularly when they're young, we'll try and guide them. We have people that work in our office that can access their accounts for them to help if they've got sponsors that they've got to get particular messages out, that type of thing, and also to kind of just give them a nudge. Hey, don't forget, we've got a fight coming up. We need you to kind of put some more stuff out, etc., etc.
Sure.
So it's that kind of relationship.
Thanks for all of your questions that are coming in thick and fast on LinkedIn and Twitter. We will get to them. There's an interesting one from Mike Sage that we will get to very shortly. But Michael, I knew you were ready there, and I picked up on that signal. I'm going to ask you a question now. We've obviously spoken about kind of I guess it's the increase of personal kind of shoulder content in boxing, like boxers fighters letting their personalities come to the fore through their own channels. We're sitting here in IMG Studios, amazing sort of production facility. You yourself are a specialist in media distribution, you know. Apparently so. 16 years in the game, like you
well remembered.
I mean, you must be approaching specialist status. What have you noticed, or indeed been a part of, about the evolution of how boxing is produced and distributed?
Well, look, I think I'll let George talk about boxing. I think from an MMA perspective,
from a fight sports perspective,
you know, UFC has probably been the pioneer of that. When UFC really hit mainstream, it was through a series called The Ultimate Fighter. That was the first series. That was 2005. They just finished season 30 in August this year. So really, content has been core to the whole concept of UFC, building characters, creating stars through a whole plethora of media platforms. And that has really been a kind of secret sauce that has been, I guess, fed its way into boxing. You see now other promoters looking at what UFC do in a kind of fight week. So we are now in a fight week for a big event this Saturday, UFC 281 at Madison Square Garden. And you go onto UFC's YouTube channel, for example. You see so much content on there through the week, through media events, through weigh-ins, through press conferences. But also we have crews following round individual fighters and creating a show called Embedded. Now that's a 7-day show, leads right up to fight night, and it's constantly reinforcing tune in for the events. It's pushing broadcasters, tune in as well, and just basically creating awareness and hopefully driving audience. The other thing that we do is we work really closely with our broadcast partners to ensure that they also have the tools to create brilliant content around our programming, around their programming, to again enhance the live product. And actually BT Sport, to be fair to them, are recognised not just by our colleagues in Las Vegas, but also actually the wider MMA community as one of the best broadcast partners from a UFC perspective in terms of creating that content, that shoulder content. So we see it as incredibly important. We see it as incredibly important giving the tools to our broadcast partners, but also it kind of starts with us. We need to kind of, you know, start the train.
Yeah, I think at Leaders, we held an event at BT Studios actually last year, and they were got WWE as well, or doing a wrestling show in the studio next door, and the screeching and screaming coming. You think these things are soundproof, right? Absolutely no way. It was amazing.
Well, and they've held an MMA event there, and actually I think
boxing.
holding
in the studios.
Yeah. So that was one of the great things about, big them up because they're here, but BT Sport been our partner now for, I think it's coming on to just over 7 years actually. And during COVID, we had the most horrific situation, like all live sports. What do we do? How do we run these things? And we kind of grouped together and figure out a plan, and we ran, I think, a series of must have been 7 or 8 shows behind closed doors live from BT Sports Studios, which was just, it kept the sport going. We kind of brought it back during the pandemic, which was hugely important to the sport.
I guess you need different sort of floor managers for a fight, so you need to mop up the blood.
A few more buckets is what you need.
Yeah.
But it is important. It was important then that the fighters need their wage.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that we've probably learned more as broadcasters.
Yeah.
It's not just for us about just the audience and giving the audience something to watch, when actually there was very little live sport available. We had Bundesliga, but we didn't really have anything else in the UK. But actually, UFC, Fight Island. But it was important to us that also the boxers themselves need paying, they need a wage, they need to be kept going, And I think that one of the challenges with the boxing is it's so peaky compared to, with football. When you buy certain sets of rights, they're so consistent. You know what you're getting, you know the schedule of it. The challenge we have is the peak and the trough, and that's actually why you need the shoulder programming and the extra content. It's for the times in between. Otherwise, you come quite cold into an event. And if you've not a person who's bought a ticket to go to an event, then actually, how do you know it's coming? So we have to use all the other tools we have on the linear channels, like promoting in the middle of Champions League during the week, so that we can get people to know boxing is coming back. And here's where it is, because our struggle is venues, your struggle is venues against the competition and timing and scheduling. It's quite difficult.
And it's a really good point from a sales perspective. So UFC, 42 events a year, you pretty much know you're going to get 3 events a month, generally. We go to a broadcaster, they take everything. With boxing, it's slightly different. We go to them and say, it's going to be kind of 12 to 15 events. We don't know exactly when they are. We don't know exactly who's going to be fighting, but it's Queensberry, so you know there's going to be a level of quality. So some broadcasters take everything. At the beginning of the year, they say, okay, we'll take everything. But others just say that we'll see who's fighting, and then we'll make a decision. So actually, from a fight perspective, it's imperative that obviously the best fights happen, because that's where the bigger interest happens. But also just from a commercial value perspective, from a sport perspective, those bigger fights just get bigger distribution. So it just helps the sport as a whole.
Amplifies it.
I'm interested to know, Louisa, from your perspective, you talked there about sort of how it's a slightly different proposition to something like a football, these fight sports. From a pay-per-view perspective, how is that model evolving as sort of the world changes around us, increasingly digital, all these different offerings? How is it evolving? How is it changing? And what are the pros and cons in operating in a new space?
I think you start by saying, nobody loves pay-per-view, right? Nobody wants to say to people, oh, you have a subscription product and now you have to pay on top. Like, we don't love it as broadcasters. We don't want to put that in front of a consumer, but the economics of some, especially in boxing, the economics of that business mean that sometimes that is just what you have to do in order to get that fight to happen. If you don't do that, the fight won't happen because you can't fund it any other way. So I think for us, the challenge is always making sure that if you're buying BT Sport and you've come in for any of the combat sports, you still get a really strong value for money product in the subscription product. And then the pay-per-views, we consider them quite carefully on a per event basis. Is this fight big enough at a caliber level to be considered pay-per-view? Because that's been a premium standard for decades. Like, we all can remember when we were kids and we watched pay-per-view and you know, people like you, Sean, like Mike Tyson, etc. But we have to be very careful where you draw that line. The interesting thing for me is actually, if you look at YouTube boxing, that's all a lot of that's pay-per-view, if not all of it. Cool. And that is appealing to a very different audience who traditionally traditional boxing fans would say that is not pay-per-view. But actually, people are paying for that for pay-per-view because they're engaged in it and they're interested in it. So to me, the evolution has come with the sort of split of those two things. And to me, I don't disparage one and praise the other. They're two different types of event. It's exhibition boxing more than professional boxing. They're in two different calibers, but you can learn quite a lot from them because, like we were saying earlier, those guys are good. Jake's good at what he does.
Great self-promoter.
Yeah, he's a brilliant self-promoter, and he's promoting other fighters like Amanda Serrano. He's bringing other people up with him. There is a lot to be learnt from that, and you can watch that and say, actually, what could traditional boxing pick up from that? They're not the same thing, but I also think one is, over time, might bring some audience in to Tyson's fights, might get even more viewers because they're moving up from there. And those are the kind of things that we're interested in following and watching.
You were all very generous and open-minded before we came on. You said, yes, you're happy to field any question, keep them coming, ask your viewers and listeners to ask what they want. So I'm going to put this to the test. Well, I'm going to repay that with a little bit of love, first of all. Okay. And specifically, it's for Louisa. Olivia says, Louisa, I love the crown and boxing as well. So, that's at least two of us. Right, we've got a question from Michael Sage, and interpret this as you will. And George, I think I'm going to come to you first. Sure. How do you get people to care with continued challenges against the integrity of the sport?
It's a very good question. I think that you have to ultimately get to a position where the good of the sport will always shine, and that's what you have to believe. You have to keep going to work and make it happen. He's obviously talking about some of the implications that happened recently around the likes of Conor Benn, and unfortunately, certainly from my perspective and from Louisa's, certain fights not happening. It's part of the sport. It is difficult at times. The job of us, though, is we can only control what we can control. The fighters that we work with and the broadcasters and the rights distribution agencies such as IMG that we work with. And it's our job to deliver the best content that we possibly can, that we have contractual availability to do. Governing bodies can be frustrating at times, and I know fans can get confused and complicated with them, but they're there to serve a purpose. They're there to make sure that contenders get their shots, that people can't get bypassed. And the method, I would say, on the whole works. It does sometimes tend to get frustrating. It's always the ones that fall out that kind of get the most media attention. You know, you forget about the ones. But I'll give a really good example. We've got a huge fight coming up for Anthony Yard, who is the WBO world #1 and mandatory challenger. He's fighting Artur Beterbiev. Anthony has been awarded that shot by winning certain fights and getting that mandatory position. He's been ordered to have that fight. We've negotiated terms with Top Rank. We've secured those rights. We'll be announcing that fight in due course, and it will be live from London on BT Sport. So the method usually works. I would say things like when Fury AJ doesn't happen, I share everyone's frustration. Like, no one wanted to see that fight more than me. Trust me, the amount of sleepless nights and telephone calls and Zooms and effort that went into that, I won't get those hours back. All I can hope is that eventually one day we'll see it.
Well, you will get those hours back, right? Because it didn't happen, but it's not saying it will never happen.
I'm not saying, no, never say never. I mean, but for me, it was an interesting point. There's moments in time to fight. Personally, I think that was the moment in time right there. Yeah. It was there to be done, but we move on. I think you've got to take the pros and as well as the cons of anything. Yeah. We're into, as Queensberry, our second UK stadium fight this year. Yeah. It's the third pay-per-view event on BT Sport this year. We've done a huge fight in Tyson Fury and Dillian White again, who deservedly got his mandatory shots. I'm talking about how the governing bodies can be frustrating, but eventually do work. He got his shot, had a fantastic night at Wembley Stadium, 94,000 people there. Joe Joyce, who did a fantastic job against Joe Parker, he got his shot, an amazing night of boxing. Fury versus Chisora, December 3rd. It's, boxing in this country is healthy. That's what I'd say. So people trust us. We're in a really good place. I know there's always inklings of problems, but they usually end up with good things happening.
I think we've probably got time for another question from Cam, but before we get there, sorry Cam, I know you're ready. I just want to make sure that Michael and Louisa have an opportunity to answer that if they want to as well. The question about sort of making people care when there are questions over integrity. George, as a promoter, obviously, I guess, has responsibility for getting that product out there, but you're selling it and you're showing it. You've got to have your views on that as well.
Yeah, look, I think, well, I'm also a fan, right?
Sure.
So from a fan's perspective, I think what's really interesting is that there is so much content now on YouTube about the business of boxing, and I think it's way too much. There's far too many promoters.
You think there's too much stuff about the business of boxing out there?
Just a little bit. You know, some promoters open their fridge door, see a red light, and they do a 20-minute piece to camera. So it's just unnecessary. A lot more conversations need to be happening behind the scenes, and I think the fans will actually get frustrated less because they don't get promised all these things that ultimately don't materialise.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one thing. I think from a sales perspective, look, every sport has its issues, and boxing, MMA is no different to every other sport. Look what's happening with the World Cup. We won't go into it, but it's not unique. And I think as long as the best keep fighting the best and the best events keep happening, boxing will always drive an audience.
Mm-hmm. And Louisa, do you want to have your say on that?
I think that, you know, you look at them as well. I think that you have to protect the fighters too.
Yeah.
So I think what you can't do is put the money first as a broadcaster. Mm-hmm. You have to be willing to say, I can't support this. I don't like the look of it. I don't want to be associated with it if it doesn't look like it is being done in the right way. And I think we've had conversations in the past, and I think we're completely on the same page that you have to protect the boxers themselves from feeling like they have no choice but to fight, when maybe they have injured themselves, when maybe they're putting themselves in a place which is a bit unhealthy for them, maybe trying to make weight or whatever it is. I think you have to be responsible and say, actually, let's stop this, despite the fact that you would lose money on it. And we have done that before. We have pulled things and as a consequence lost a lot of money on them because it was the right thing to do. And I think you can't lose sight of that. It's not a money-making business that at all costs must make money. That isn't the way that it should be. Like, you have to put that first, and I think that's how we feel.
Sometimes you've got to roll with the punches, right? Would you say that? Great. Let's not end on that note.
I think we have to, unfortunately. I'd love to sit here and fire questions at you all day, but I think, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thanks so much for your time. Louisa Clark, George Warren and Michael Ridout, thanks for being with us. Thanks to Richard Thomas.
And that's it for today's Leaders Live. We're back in December, just before the end of the World Cup, December the 15th. Do join us then. In the meantime, thanks for being with us. Bye-bye for now.